Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and I'm glad to welcome you back to our program featuring cutting-edge conversations with business leaders and creative luminaries tailored to global security professionals. Today we begin a special 4-episode series focusing on the ISF's latest report, Threat Horizon 2023, Security at a Tipping Point. And as we do with every threat overview, just a warning that this is the report that will keep you up at night. Steve, today let's set the stage for this threat report, and then over the next few weeks we'll dig deeper into each of the 3 major threats featured in the report. So let's jump right in then. The report's predictions are pretty dire. We are forecasting that by 2023, our established norms, our established way of life will fall by the wayside as global turbulence and upheaval pushes the information security industry to that tipping point. What do you have to tell us about that dire threat?
Cheerful, isn't it? It's I mean, our podcast series have focused on a whole range of different things over the times that we've been doing these, Tavia. And every year we talk about the threat horizon, don't we? And every year we talk about how things are getting worse from a security standpoint, how businesses need to really be aware of what's happening. And I still, I say this every time, I still see the Threat Horizon report as being a really positive, constructive document that, if used properly, can be used to help navigate through some of the really challenging ways in which technology is changing, and our use of technology, it must be said, is changing the way that businesses operate, and indeed the way in which leaders need to perhaps adapt not just their style, but also the way in which they run businesses to take into account some of those challenges. So for me, the Threat Horizon is always something that I look forward to very much, because it just sort of highlights some of the challenges that are out there. But more importantly, for me, it gives you a little bit of a pathway to navigate around it.
Well, where do you want to start? The future projected in the report is really daunting, so tell us where we're headed.
I think one of the things that is important to point out with the Threat Horizon is that whenever we put this together, we take into account a whole range of different elements. So we do look at it from a political perspective, from an economic perspective, from a societal standpoint, and so on. And so, if we go back and look at it just from a political standpoint for a moment, to give that context, global politics, as far as we're concerned anyway, and to a certain extent diplomatic relationships leading up to 2023, which is the overall scope of the report, as you know, will, I think, unfortunately, still be defined by the pandemic, COVID-19, with the policies, strategies that governments implemented during what has been, and I think is probably set to continue through this year, to be a really turbulent period. We've also seen, that changing of the guard in US politics as a result of the 2020 election. And I think that's going to prompt a change to the overall US approach to international relations and the mechanisms, therefore, that govern them. We also saw across in Europe, of course, that the UK left the European Union. So Brexit finally came about. There's a question over what the UK's influence will look like in Europe and on a global stage after that. So I think what we've got as a sort of political context is shifting sands, a lot of change. Organizations as well, really getting caught up in some of that, because organizations do have to work against that overall political backdrop, right? And that impacts the way in which anybody who's operating a business across geographies has to really formulate strategy. So politically, I think a lot of change, and that's the backdrop, very turbulent, and that's the context for some of the threats that we're talking about.
How is the economy going to be impacted?
I think if I could answer that question with any degree of certainty, I'd probably be doing something different other than talking to you on a podcast. I do think, though, that economic growth will be on a path to recovery by the time we get to 2023. I think it's going to take some countries that while to get back to that. And I'm not implying for one moment that we're going to be able to pay off some of the debt that's been incurred. That's going to be with us for generations in some instances. But I do think that some of the recessionary indications that we've seen coming out of different countries will have subsided to a certain extent. Nations such as Taiwan, perhaps South Korea, that managed the pandemic particularly effectively, are pretty much set to recover more quickly. You could posit that may make them key drivers then of global trade coming off the back of that. I think that there will be some inequality around some of the economic relationships that we see around the world that's probably reinforced by some of this uneven access to vaccines that different nations secure. I also think, though, that there's going to be quite a lot of opportunity I think that larger organizations that, came through the recession thanks to their, perhaps it was robust business continuity, perhaps it was their crisis management policies, they're going to emerge even stronger. And we're starting to see already quite a bit of consolidation across industries. The whole M&A business is really picking up again. And it isn't just distressed companies that are being snapped up, although a large number of those are, of course. But it is other organizations, coming together to take advantage of opportunities that are self-identifying.
When we talk about COVID and the lingering impacts of COVID, we have to consider the pandemic's impact globally, politically, economically, personally, and professionally as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we've talked about it quite a bit on these podcasts that we've done this year, haven't we? I think personal and professional lives, they have changed dramatically. We've seen our cities being redesigned. We've seen other urban spaces as well, reflecting that shift from office-based work to working at home, to remote working, whatever that looks like for a variety of people. And I think that one of the things that has done and will continue to do is bring about a bit of a paradigm shift in privacy. People will strive to carve out some form of digital identity that's free from intrusive monitoring, from surveillance. The World Wide Web, I think, will finally come into its own as billions of people in developing nations come online, adding to diversity, which we probably haven't seen enough of up until now. But that's also going to present organizations with a whole variety of new information security issues. If you just think about, privacy, home working, new people coming online, or you combine all of those if you're a multinational organization, and there's tremendous amount of change. And one thing that we talked about before, again, is that, if you look at information security, as a rule, one of the things we do not like is huge amounts of very fast change because it's difficult to keep up. But I think, unfortunately, that's what we're going to see.
Technology development certainly is not going to slow down.
No, not at all. I think that AI is going to start coming into its own. By the time we look forward to 2023, then certainly some of the AI-based applications will be gimmicks, but others will bring about significant advancements. I think as well that we'll have got better to adapting and to working with AI-based aids that have the potential anyway to automate many of some of the more mundane tasks that we see. And there's no doubt, again, if we look at it just from that pure security standpoint, that organizations are going to adopt some of those tools to really improve the way in which they monitor what it is that's going on across their extended networks. And then on the other side, organizations are going to use AI to improve interactions with customers and enhance the way in which they can deliver service to them as well. But as with all of these things, we're also going to see malicious actors taking advantage of AI. We refer in the report to, AI as a service. So we talked about crime as a service. We're now seeing AI moving much more into that space as well. And that could really supercharge cyber attacks. So technology, bringing lots of different advances, being useful as always, but we always have to look at the flip side of that too.
So we are going to see a change in crime and illegal activity expand and morph. Are we going to see a commensurate response in terms of legal regulation?
I think we will. The thing to bear in mind is regulation always tends to lag the market. I think that, the historically high level of legal practices used to restrict trade that we've seen at the moment will persist into 2023 as economies recover and rebuild. I think that, and we're seeing this already, the US, the EU, and other countries will look to rein in social media firms through perhaps antitrust legislation, and will also pass stricter regulations governing online content. So I think that's just a normal progression, a maturing, if you like, of that particular space. I think organizations will be required to ensure that, back to AI, that AI-based algorithms meet requirements on fairness, as many jurisdictions look to police this very widely adopted technology. I also think that there'll be some advances in legislation that I expect anyway in relation to digital identities. And there's a lot of discussion going on about that at the moment. Again, a lot of it driven by the pandemic, of course, and the ways in which personal data can be gathered, can be used. So I think as well, we're going to see a fairly rapid growth in the number and variety of different regulations that really will affect and impact information security. And I think that's going to make compliance an ongoing challenge that unfortunately consumes more and more resource, but I don't really see any way around it. So it's something of a necessary evil. I suppose my biggest fear in that space, though, is that the focus that should be being applied to information security becomes diverted to focus on compliance. And as we know, good compliance does not necessarily mean good information security.
Well, no terrifying discussion about the future would be complete if we didn't mention climate change. So, how is that going to play a role in the threat horizon?
Yeah, sad but true, isn't it? I mean, the way in which organizations and consumers generate and distribute power will undergo a very rapid change, I think, over the period of this report. As the price of generating energy from renewables, particularly solar, continues to fall, smart grids, I think, are going to suffer teething problems. We're starting to see that affect organizations pretty much all over the world. And this regular occurrence of extreme weather events will certainly, I think, lead to more natural disasters. We don't seem collectively, globally, able to agree on how to best address climate change. And I think that those disagreements are set to continue, which means that, significant action is going to be uncoordinated and perhaps not as effective as it might be. And I think also that, as the number and type of energy providers expands to include startups, in addition to high-tech companies, cybersecurity may not receive some of the care and attention that it deserves. And that again could play into the hands of malicious actors who are intent on disrupting energy supplies.
So it sounds like 2023 is going to see organizations really struggling to cope with these monumental shifts that are leaving businesses and security leaders completely off balance.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the lasting effects of the pandemic, coming back to that, will accelerate trends that fundamentally change the business landscape. And the information security industry is finding itself at a tipping point, on the verge of potentially being overwhelmed by some of the things we've just been talking about that are actually beyond its control.
So tell us about the major threats that ISF forecasts in this report.
Sure. Well, first, as technology continues to advance, I think that humans will be pushed aside in favor of automation that not only improves the capabilities of attackers, but also proves, potentially anyway, unreliable in securing organizations' information. Layered security practices will inadvertently, I think, create confusion as policies, processes, and technologies continue to proliferate and clash, resulting in a host of unseen vulnerabilities for a lot of organizations. And I think secondly, citizens, people, you and I, will sometimes quite unwittingly make vast amounts of intimate data available, allowing malicious actors to weaponize digital identity. This use of falsified yet highly convincing credentials, I think, has the potential to significantly undermine trust, certainly compromise information assets, and therefore distort business models. And then finally, the world in which organizations operate, I think, is going to be characterized by constant macroeconomic, geopolitical, social, environmental change. And we were just talking about some of those things. These prevailing forces will really push, I think, the security industry to deal with emerging threats that perhaps it's ill-equipped to handle. The security industry risks being, I think, overwhelmed by just a deluge of change. And I think we all have to, step up to the challenge and guide our organizations back from the tipping point that I think inevitably we're going to find ourselves headed towards.
The report has a wealth of information, but I understand that it's also encouraging readers to assess the forecasts presented and to consider them in the context of their own organization, their own unique set of circumstances. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The report itself highlights a number of different threats. Not all of them are going to be applicable to each and every organization. And, whilst we would hope that we get it pretty much right in terms of forecasting what the future looks like, and certainly we do, mark our own homework in terms of how well did we do in terms of predicting that. I think the key to it all for me, from a usage standpoint in the report, is applying it to your own organization. So, taking the input in the report that we've got from ISF members all around the world, from the ISF global team, from external experts, and really asking a few questions in relation to that. So, are the predictions reasonable? Do perhaps some underestimate the severity of certain scenarios as they relate to an individual business? Do others go too far? How might forecasts be adapted in the context of your own organization? One of the other things I think that it's worthwhile doing is just sort of saying, well, what additional material do I need to gather to support any form of organizational review of the predicted threats in this report? It may be that I'm suddenly planning on expanding across geography over the next 3 years. Well, maybe then I need to look at a much more localized perspective on some of these threats. But it's all about how you tailor the interpretation of these threats to your own organization. And there are certain tools that you can use. We talk in the report about our threat radar, for instance, that can be used. We talk about our risk assessment methodologies and tools, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. It's all about risk management. It's all about how do we balance what we're intending to do from a strategic developmental perspective, from a company point of view, against some of these emerging threats, and how do we assess the importance of dealing with those to the direction in which we're headed. And nobody can really answer those questions other than the leaders of the organizations that are tasked with rolling out those strategies. And hopefully the threat horizon helps to give some context for that.
I am sort of left terrified, but I think after a year of massive change, I'm less shocked by this report than I used to be in the past. And maybe what we've all weathered prepares us a little bit to be less surprised by what's coming, more ready to deal with it. So maybe I feel more empowered this year than I have in past years.
I think the whole point of the threat horizon is to try to, as you say, empower. It really is to try to highlight, some of the key things that you can do something about. And I think to your point about the pandemic, that was not something that many people forecast. It wasn't something that people knew how to respond to, how to react to. And the threat horizon is trying to avoid that kind of situation. We're
world-weary, hardened people now. We're just ready for the next crisis.
You look at it and you think, well, how important is it really? If you boil it all down, does it really matter? But I think that's quite a useful test. If you've got to look at just a small number of threats, then which are the ones that really matter? Because you can worry about all sorts of things, can't you? So I think it's really important to still get that bigger picture. The context is important, and the impact, potentially.
Well, over the next 3 episodes, we're going to dive into each of those specific threats in more detail. We can't look at everything, but we're going to look at the ones that really matter, the ones on the threat horizon. And we'll discuss their effect on business and get to the heart of ISF's recommendations for how organizations can begin to mitigate the impact. Our first detailed conversation about the threat horizon will focus on machines seizing control. So we'll be back next week for that full episode. And thank you again for your time and for your terror. I know that new threats are developing in coordination with old threats that are evolving, and so, as usual, we will have plenty to talk about. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Listeners, here's a short preview of that episode on machines seize control.
So I do think we're going to get ourselves into a little bit of a situation where AI is facing off against AI, if you see what I mean, and how that pans out. We'll have to wait and see. I think it's going to be on an organization by organization basis, depending on the degree of sophistication that exists on both sides, actually, attack and defense.
ISF members, you can log in to find the full report on ISF Live, and non-members, be sure to check securityforum.org for more information. Until next week, we invite you to tune into our catalog of video and podcast episodes, all of which you can find at securityforum.org. If you feel today's conversation was of value, please follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts and recommend us. Your endorsement helps us reach new audiences and helps us continue to bring you these valuable discussions. You can always join in the conversation on our LinkedIn page at linkedin.com/company/information-security-forum. Or you can get in touch directly through our website, where you can also download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.